Good morning. I hope you all are doing well. Good morning so far? Good. I did sneak in, so sorry to get by you there. My name is Ryan Lombardi, as was mentioned. I'm the Vice President for Student and Campus Life up at Cornell. Relative newcomer to Tompkins County. Been here about 16 months. Started in August 2015. Not surprising to anyone in this room, one of the first things that was on the agenda that was given to me when I arrived is to start taking a hard look at student housing on campus and what our needs are and what we need to focus on and how we need to advance that in the future. The good news is that I do have experience in this framework. At my previous institution, I had initiated a very large housing master plan at our previous campus. We had finished phase one when I left, which was a pretty large construction project, so I was excited to jump in on that here. As I've gone through it, I will say for the past about 8 or 9 months, I would say there are a few more layers to the onion here than I might have initially wondered, which again is no surprise to any of you in the room. And so I'm really glad to be here and share some of our thinking and where we're at. As you know, this is an iterative process, and so we make our way through it. We learn as we go. We pivot as we go, given the inputs and the dynamics and the contexts. But again, really pleased to share with you some of our thinking at this point in time. I'll also just say as a side note, it's been a real treat for me and my family to be here in Tompkins County. It's my first foray into upstate New York, although my wife is originally from the Syracuse area, so it's kind of a homecoming for her. You all took it easy on me last winter, and I'm hoping for a couple more of those. I'm originally from the Midwest, so I'm actually not that averse to winter. I was born in Iowa, but spent a lot of my adult life down in North Carolina, so I'm slowly adjusting. So the Student Housing Master Plan, we launched this process about last January or February is when we really got started in this aggressively. I needed a little time under my feet to get used to the landscape before we launched this, but we've been working very hard since that point to really understand what we want to do from a housing perspective. What I'm going to share today, I will tell you, is heavily focused on the undergraduate student housing experience. That doesn't mean that's the only thing we've looked at by any means, but what I want to share with you today, because that is, in terms of raw numbers, that tends to be one of our bigger challenges. That's really what I'm going to focus on today. It was just mentioned by Ed about Maplewood and that project that's going for us, which is going to increase substantially our graduate student housing. And we also think that some of the decisions that we're moving towards at Cornell will have a downstream effect and help with that graduate population as well. So I wanted to preface that. I also wanted to say we have been trying to be as inclusive as possible as we've gone through this process. We formed a community advisory committee. Susan Riley, who I think is here, I think I saw you, Susan, has been leading for us to help try to keep the information flow good between the community and between campus. We've held some open forums on campus as we've evolved and tried to be pretty transparent with this. Of course, it's difficult. We have lots of folks that we're answering to with our board of trustees and with our constituents, with the community, and trying to balance that all as we go along and being cautious at the same point not to suggest, because plans do constantly evolve and shift, that we don't want to put a stake in the ground and say this is it, undoubtedly, unquestionably. We want to give ourselves flexibility as this evolves. So just a couple of ways I wanted to preface this. So as we started out thinking about the future of housing at Cornell, the first thing that we were required to do is really step back and think about what we want this residential experience to be. Now, many of you may know that the founders of Cornell actually suggested that Cornell should not be in the student housing business, that part of the value of a college education was living in the community. So that was a founding principle of Cornell. It was a real surprise to me when I kind of uncovered that and learned about our history. So we needed to step back and say, look, are we going to stay true to that principle, or do we really want to move in a different direction? And in some ways, the university obviously has moved in a different direction. Some would argue not quite enough, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we first talk about the principles that are important to us from a sense of the student experience. Many of these principles that you see on the screen are actually already in place and have been in place for upwards of 2 decades. So these are not necessarily new, but the ones that are bolded and underlined are the areas that we honed in on that we feel like we need to do a better job of moving forward. So we currently do guarantee on-campus housing to both our first and second year undergraduate students. We actually don't have enough capacity to meet that guarantee if all of them took us up on that. So as an example here, we want to make sure that that's a guarantee that we can actually meet. Similarly, with transfer students, we used to guarantee housing for transfer students coming, and we've had to back away from that just because of the capacity crunch on campus. So we first started to look at these principles, and I'm not going to read through them all because you can do that as I'm speaking, and made sure we were clear about what we were trying to create as a residential experience on the Cornell campus. And then that starts to get us into some elements programmatically of what that experience might look like. And again, I'm not going to read through all these because you can do that, but the bolded and underlined are newer programmatic components that we want to think about incorporating as we move forward and think about the future of housing on campus. When the North Campus, it's been really interesting for me too, because I was recruited and hired in by President Garrett when she was taking office, and obviously, we had a tragedy there. I've had the privilege to work with President Rawlings for, since last April, and it's interesting that we're having this conversation given that he was the president when the North Campus Residential Initiative was put in place, the West Campus House System was put in place, so it's been really informative to have that conversation. So on this the second point about the townhouses on North Campus, when the North Campus Residential Initiative was established, the idea there was to have a communal common experience for first-year students that was heavily integrative, and that would build community and foster community as students are transitioning into college life. Because of the capacity crunch, we've had to put some of our first-year students in what we would call suboptimal environments for that development. And a townhouse is an example of that. Not suboptimal necessarily in terms of quality, but suboptimal in terms of that right environment conducive to an 18-year-old first-year student who's trying to integrate to a college experience. And putting them in an apartment-style unit where they're fairly isolated from their peers is not necessarily a good way to help those students integrate into a communal experience. So we want to get away from that. We want to get away from having first-year students in those types of environments that don't help that, what really were the principles and the foundation behind the North Campus Residential Initiative. And we've also heard a lot of interest from our second-year students about being able to stay in one place a little longer than they currently, actually all students, being able to stay in one place a little bit longer than they currently can. A lot of our students talk about, and in our survey and our work here, talked about feeling like they always have one foot out the door when it comes to their housing. So as soon as they get housing for 1 year, they have to start thinking ahead to the next year, and they never really even feel like they have a home base or that they can establish themselves or do anything like that. So this concept of more second-year students on North Campus is a concept that we've been developing as we think about providing that option for our students. Many of you may be surprised to know, because the perception now is that all freshmen live up on North, everyone else lives on West or then moves into College Town, etc. We actually have 800 non-first-year students already living on North Campus right now. So a lot of people are surprised by that. There's a perception that it's only first-year students up there, and that's not the case. So this leads us in a general framework to really want to double down on what we see as this developmental residential trajectory, whereby the first 2 years of a student's experience at Cornell are largely on campus. We think that that's appropriate for their development and their integration into the Cornell community and into the Tompkins County community, because they're trying to get their feet on the ground. They're trying to figure out and get confidence in the classroom and with their peer groups and all these types of elements. And in our perspective, the last thing we need to be adding to their lives in terms of high stress is housing and where they're going to live down the road. So we'd like to get ourselves to a point where the first 2 years, students are on campus, immersed in that residential environment. And then the second 2 years are largely in an off-campus experience, with a caveat there, because right now, our juniors and seniors, we house about 1,200 juniors and seniors on campus right now. And those are fairly intentional numbers for us, a lot of RAs, but also students who want to continue with a co-op or a fraternity or a sorority or in a program house or something along those lines. And we want to continue to support that level of junior and senior engagement in those third and fourth years. But again, acknowledging that the vast majority of those third and fourth years is when developmentally students can start to branch out a little bit and have a greater variety of options, think about more autonomy and independence, which fits very appropriately with their developmental trajectory. In these first 2 years, again, focusing on that first year experience, like I said, in a very community-based, integrative experience. In the second year, it starts to open up a little bit. There are more options on campus, ideally, that we can provide to them, like West Campus, like staying on North Campus, the townhouses, getting into Greek organizations, co-ops, but still in the on-campus envelope. And you'll see how that bears out here in just a minute. So as we went through our plan, we identified 3 major problems that we're trying to address as we develop this plan. The first one is deferred maintenance. We have a substantial backlog of deferred maintenance in the residence halls at Cornell, and this is something that we have to address. It creates a lot of issues for us, not the least of which is a lot of variety and quality for our students and their experience. But this is a challenge for us to meet, not only because it's incredibly expensive and the volume dollar-wise that we need to catch up on this is quite prohibitive, but we also don't have the capacity to do this. Those of you who are in this business know that in order to renovate a building and to fix up a building, you've got to close it down. And if you do that, you've displaced X number of students who were living in that building. So before we can even start to address this, even if we had the financial resources to do so, we need more capacity just to be able to empty some of those buildings out and then renovate them. Our 4 highest needs right here are listed on the screen, and those account for about 2/3 of all of our deferred maintenance backlog in the residential housing environment. So if we could accomplish the key maintenance and renovation of those facilities, that would accommodate about 2/3 of that backlog. As you see, these are virtually all significant buildings, right? These are not the kind of buildings you're just going to raise. You're not going to tear down the Gothics, or at least I don't think I would do that unless I needed to look for a new job. So these are buildings that you need to start thinking about how you invest in them, because they do have very historic significance to the campus and to the community. But we have.
Can we have questions, please?
Well, so each one's, so Balch as an example is about 430 students. Clara Dixon Hall, I think, is about 500 students. Risley is about 150. Where's Marty? 200, and then the West Campus Gothics in some are about 500, I think. So you need a swing space to the factor of a 450 to 500 person capacity growth just to start addressing some of this deferred maintenance. So then the next issue that we need to begin to solve for is capacity growth for current students. We know that many more students would like to live on campus than currently we can accommodate. We also know that the fact that we don't have more capacity creates all sorts of other impacts on the campus and on the community, much of which is what we're here talking about today. So we think that we want to increase the number of sophomores living on campus. I mentioned that, getting the first-year students out of the townhouses. We've maximized what we like to call in our work, maximized our residence halls, meaning sometimes we've converted spaces that were originally designed for 2 students into 3 students. We'd like to de-densify those a little bit. We know if we continue to build and do some of this that we also have update needs in other areas of student life, like dining, like recreation, and we'd also like more flexibility around additional themed group housing. This capacity crunch, and I'm not going to say a lot about this in terms of its outward effect on the community, because I think you all very keenly feel that and are aware of that. It puts this pressure, this upward pressure on the community in terms of the rents and the occupancies and all that types of stuff. It also puts a lot of stress on our students, of course, and this is going back to what I said, where our students, our class of 2020 who just arrived this fall, within the first couple weeks of their landing at Cornell, they already have to start thinking about where they're going to live in that second year. And if they're thinking about signing a lease off campus, if they're a year out, if they let that lap, if they start thinking about it now, they're behind the curve on that. And if they're going to wait and go through maybe the Greek recruitment process or the co-op Mosey process or the housing lottery, they have to kind of hedge their bets and decide what they're going to do. So again, we've put a lot of stress on our students as well as the community, and we want to try to solve that. Just to give you a sense of our occupancy as it stands currently with our current capacity, this gives you some framework for what we do accommodate on campus. So essentially what we're talking about with this plan is taking this sophomore bar that's currently at about 59% of our sophomores living on campus and moving that virtually all the way to the right, so that we would be accommodating 100% of our sophomores on campus and not changing anything else on here. So keeping the first year experience the way it is, and like I said, maintaining a fairly steady state of juniors and seniors. And we think that, of course, it might not solve all the issues, but we think it would make a significant enhancement to that student experience and then have an outward effect on the community experience as well. And the last thing I want to accommodate for as I think about this is any growth that might occur in the future. That's part of the challenge, and as I've learned a little bit about Cornell and how it's grown over the years, if you look back at the last 10 years and just a steady growth that's happened over that time has exacerbated this challenge and this capacity issue that we've had. And so what we want to do as we develop this plan is make sure that we build in room for growth to happen without that putting further strain or exacerbating the issue we have today. So in other words, if there's going to be growth, we want to be able to accommodate that for that in whatever we do on campus. And I know there are always a lot of questions about what's the growth, what's that going to look like, how's that going to be. The provost is working through that right now with the campus and with the college deans. It's his desire to be strategic in this. And I think what's happened over the last 10 years is that it's just kind of crept up year after year, not necessarily in a strategic to say we're going to grow this much and then move towards that target. It's just happened kind of incrementally and added to. So the provost is trying to take a very strategic approach this time around with that growth so that, again, that we can meet whatever demand that places on the housing inventory. So those are our three key issues that we're going to be trying to solve in the plan that we are putting together. So what that leads us to is think about where we can, if you go back just to show you the percentages, where we could build enough housing to move that sophomore bar to the right. You can get a sense of the factor of what we're talking there, about 1,400 beds, just given today's current enrollment and where we could do that. So then we start to look at siting options and what that might look like. That quickly moves us towards North Campus. When we look at where we have land available and relatively easily developable, and when I say that, doesn't require tens of millions of dollars up front just to prep the sites and do those types of things. It really puts us up on the North Campus community as a viable place for us to grow this on-campus capacity. You see the types of factors we were looking at there in terms of assessing sites that might be viable. And then moving on here to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So this image represents what would look like a full build-out if we were to be able to accomplish that full growth of accommodating all sophomores on campus and what that would look like up on North Campus. If you see right here, these are the townhouses where the laser pointer is. Those are currently the townhouses. I mentioned of the 300 beds there right now, 248 of them are filled with first-year students. We want to get those first-year students out of there, convert those to sophomore housing, build some new residence halls around Lot CC and around the RPCC Center here, primarily for sophomore housing. Additional dining to support. When we start to grow that much on-campus capacity, you're going to need additional dining. We can't support all that through our existing dining in RPCC, and also adding another first-year residence hall over in this vicinity next to Appel Fields. And the reason we color-coded this is so you see that we really still are trying to maintain some cohesion around a first-year experience, where the first-year students all live in this kind of corridor that you can see lined up here, but then also create a very attractive sophomore village up on North Campus as well that would accommodate that growth in sophomores who stay on campus in the future. Part of the attraction of doing so is having the kinds of living environments like townhouses that are more attractive to sophomores, more independence, new dining. One thing that will be coming into play at some point in this is recreation, enhanced recreation facilities up in that neighborhood as well. So this represents a pretty ambitious plan. This is a concept that we're exploring right now. This isn't a done deal. So again, in that spirit of what I said at the beginning, you start to show these things and everyone zooms in on it's done and it's fully baked. That's not the case. This is a concept, and through our housing master planning process, a concept that's gotten a lot of support and that people, including our students, feel generally would start to really help, and that in our community conversations would dramatically start to help this crunch and this pressure that we have from a housing perspective. We're very much getting into the conversation of how we might accomplish this. This is kind of a what this might look like, how we might accomplish this in the future. And obviously that is also a very robust conversation we're having, because we're talking about that brings in financing and affordability and all those types of things. What we know we can't do is put this all on the backs of our students in terms of just, shooting our housing rates up through the roof or anything along those lines. So we really have to be creative in thinking about how we might solve this kind of a growth that we would hope to achieve through our planning process. So that is a summary of where Cornell is at right now. We've got a concept. We've got kind of some hopes and aspirations of what we hope to accomplish as we move along. And we'll be continuing to have conversations on campus and in the community and with our board to understand how we might accomplish that concept as we go forward. And we'll continue our commitment to as many conversations as we can possibly have as we go along to keep everybody in the community informed. So, thank you.